North Carolina has a new defensive coordinator in Gene Chizik, who brings with him a new defensive scheme. In this era of the transfer portal and everybody moving around, how quick is it now to overhaul your defense and get the personnel you need? Great question. Good thing John Garcia Jr. is joining us today. He's going to help us unpack it from a recruiting standpoint on today's episode of Locked On Tar Heels.
You are Locked On Tar Heels, your daily podcast on the UNC Tar Heels. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hey there, it's Friday, May 13th, 2022. Welcome into the Locked On Tar Heels podcast. I'm your host, Isaac Schade. I'm a beat writer for Sports Illustrated's All Tar Heels website. And I want to thank you for making Locked On Tar Heels your first listen or your first watch every single day. Please remember that we are free and available anywhere you get podcasts. And for those of you watching, go ahead, hit that subscribe button, smash the like button, leave a comment. Love to hear your thoughts about what we're going to talk about today as you listen. Speaking of which, that is Mr. John Garcia joining us. Love it when he does that. We got some great football content to talk about, including an interview he had with Lejond Cavazos. We are joined again here on Locked On Tar Heels by friend of the program at this point, Mr. John Garcia Jr. Great recruiting from Sports Illustrated for football, and so excited to have him with us as has been for each of the last several weeks now. And so today we're going to be talking a lot about the new defensive scheme instituted by Gene Chizik as he comes in. But before we do that, you might recall that last week we talked about Lejond Cavazos, who is coming, a cornerback coming to Carolina. And since that time, John has had the opportunity to have an interview with Lejond. And so we just want to follow up on that and see what kind of information they talked about and if there's any good nuggets that John has for us coming out of that. So John, welcome in. It is great to have you as always. Thank you for being with us. And so let's talk about your interview with Lejond. Any just little morsels coming out of that?
Yeah, well, some of the best stuff made the story itself. I thought the connection between him and Bacot was even more intrinsic than we thought. It wasn't just, hey, come to Carolina like me. It was like, hey, let's go to the same school again. So IMG to Carolina pipeline, I guess, is alive and well. And him admitting that, hey, Carolina was reaching out, but so were 50 other schools. So to stand out, something like that really became a catalyst. So it's really kind of amazing to see how that works. And it began to separate Carolina from some of these others. And, he took a couple of trips. He was out at Colorado and then took the trip to Carolina. And as he said, that was it. And look, other trips were being set up. This wasn't one of those things where there wasn't a lot of interest and he was just kind of taking his time, hanging out. Like, other trips were in the works and borderline planned until he took that trip to Chapel Hill. So I thought that was interesting. And then a part that didn't make the story that I really liked in general was just the mentality that Lejond had. He was very, very serious and very, very different from when I talked to him when he was in high school. Obviously maturity brings that perspective, and he's older and he's gone through transition. He's gone through injuries, different things like that. So all that stuff will certainly build you up a little bit. But when I said, hey, what's recruiting like now versus high school?
Interesting.
And he said, it's all business now. He said, it's all serious. And I take it that way too. He said, my approach is all business now too, which is why he took the trips. And when he saw the school he wanted to go to, he was done. He didn't start, taking trips for fun and all that stuff. It was really about making this decision ahead of making that drive earlier this week, from Columbus to Chapel Hill. And I talked to him at the tail end of the drive, so he's probably a little tired as well. But beyond that, he was very serious and said that was what his whole approach was. This was a very much a business decision. There was some personal stuff that helped out along the way, with
Sure.
Armando and
Sure.
with some other things. But really it was about, an opportunity to play, which we talked about the other day or last week, I should say.
Yeah.
And just the ability to play within this Carolina defense, which is going to be more aggressive, which is going to allow him to utilize his strengths, like we talked about, being a longer, bigger corner.
Yeah. Man, I'm with you, John. I was really surprised when I read your article to hear, like you said, we had surmised that certainly Bacot played a role in that, but the sheer magnitude of how important that was really took me by surprise. And so, do you foresee that? We talked about that peer recruiting quite a bit last week when we chatted. Do you foresee that maybe now becoming even more and more of a thing?
Absolutely. Anything that can validate a school gives you an in. And in this case, like I said, a lot of schools were reaching out to both him and his father just to see, hey, do we have a chance? Are we potentially in this race?
Hmm.
So when it came to scheduling visits, something really has to stand out. And Carolina wasn't really high on his list coming out of high school. So, you usually go there first. When you talk about the transfer portal, it's like, okay,
Let's
who
circle
finished
back
second
around. Yep.
coming out
Yep.
of high school? Who was in the mix? Where did he go to high school? What are the hometown schools or the in-state schools, what have you? So when those don't exist for a school, something like a peer reaching out could certainly be a catalyst, and it totally was in this part. And then he takes the trip. Jacolby Kawan's taking the trip. He's like, look, he was like, I thought Jacolby was already going to North Carolina. So he thought that was already done. So he would be joining him
Yeah.
in that transition from Columbus to Chapel Hill. So I thought that was interesting as well. But look, any little advantage or personal touch that any school can have with any kid, it really does resonate. And sometimes it could even be a separator on the recruiting trail in terms of getting the ball rolling. And for some schools and some commits, or for some recruits, I should say, that's really the biggest part. Who gets that ball truly rolling, and who kind of looks like everyone else just as another text message in the inbox.
Man. Well, that's a screaming endorsement to me, not just for Armando Bacot, but for the campus of North Carolina, for the coaching staff with Mack Brown and what they have. John, what do you make of this more business-like recruiting scenario that has transitioned from when Lejond was in high school till now?
I just think it's the generational change we're seeing in recruiting. I mean, this is just something that has become big business in every
Mm.
sense of the word. So the quicker the prospect realizes that, Isaac, the
Hmm.
sooner he's going to be able to make decisions with that in mind. And that can remove some of, not the wash, we call it the wash in football, but some of the distracting elements of the process, right? When you first talk to a 16-year-old in recruiting, he's like, hey, Coach Garcia, because they think I'm a coach. Coach Garcia, oh, man, this school's showing so much love, and the fans are showing so much love, and that matters so much when kids are first getting on the recruiting scene.
Yeah.
These elite kids or kids who are recruited over 2-3 years, they never really bring that up in the end, right? So it was cool at the beginning. It kind of got you interested in that school, and you maybe learned a little bit more about the school, yes, but it turns to business soon after that anyway. So
Hmm.
the quicker you get there on your own as a recruit, I think the better equipped you are to navigate the process, which has become business-like on the school's end as well, right? There's only
Yeah.
so many scholarships. There's only so many official visits. There's only so many kids who have that green light to commit. So you already kind of are participating in a business-like decision, whether or not you approach it that way. So I think that's going to be more of the norm. The whole show and love and fun element is becoming a little bit fewer and far between in recruiting. And look, money is a part of that too, right? I mean, that's college football in general, right? We talk about these TV contracts, these conference TV deals, all these things that generate tons of money, and now the players can dip into that pot. So why wouldn't they approach it a little bit more seriously with a little bit more
Yeah.
in mind than just this is where I'm going to be living or this is the school I'm going to be playing for?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense to me as everything professionalizes and maybe we get collective bargaining or whatever, like with NIL and everything. Who knows? But that makes a ton of sense to me. Love it. Thank you, John, so much for that insight. And so Lejond Cavazos is going to be coming to play now for Gene Chizik's new, as you said, more aggressive defense. Can't wait to see him in action. And I want to ask John about how long it takes to get a defense flipped around in terms of personnel. And we're going to talk about that in just a moment. But first, let me tell you a little bit about Built Bar. Summer is coming, and with that, you're going to need some food on the go. So you know what? Built Bars are the perfect snack to take with you on your family trips or picnics or wherever it is. Just throw them in your bag and you got it. Make sure everyone is fueled with Built Bar for all those adventures. And keep in mind that these Built Bars and the Built Puffs are covered in 100% real chocolate. That means with Built Bar, you can eat healthy and actually enjoy doing so. And speaking of these puffs, have you tried them? They're so good and come in unexpected and fun flavors like banana cream pie or churro. Who doesn't want to eat that? Come on. And if that's not enough flavor for you, if you want more than just the one, try one of the mixed boxes. It comes with 12 different flavors of bars and puffs. Well, all you need to do is go to built.com. You can look at all the numbers to see for yourself what a great and healthy option this is. Only 130 calories, just 4 grams of sugar, and only 4 net carbs. Plus, it's got 17 grams of protein. Compare that to a normal candy bar with 240 calories and who knows how many carbs or grams of sugar, and you know which choice you need to make right now. So, go to Built.com today, check out all these delicious flavor options, and choose one for yourself. And while you're there, use promo code LOCKED15 and you're going to get 15% off that order. Again, that's promo code LOCKED15 for 15% off at Built.com. Thanks again for making Locked on Tar Heels your first listen. Keep in mind, we are the only daily Tar Heels podcast going, at least that I've ever heard of. People haven't told me anything otherwise every time I've said it, so I'm assuming that we're right and we're the only thing going. Thank you for joining us and diving in. Come bring more people to this community, and let's continue to grow it through the dog days of summer. Happy Friday. We are here today talking with John Garcia Jr. from Sports Illustrated, college football recruiting extraordinaire. He is with us as he always is. And right now we're going to transition to talking about North Carolina's defense. As you may well know, Carolina brought in a new defensive coordinator this year, a guy with a ton of experience, a great name in the industry, and that is Gene Chizik. Now, one of the things Chizik will be doing is changing the defensive scheme, which inevitably means you're kind of stuck with the personnel you've already got, but you have to find the guys to fit that scheme. And so, John, I think my first question to you is just very simply, how long does it take to adjust your recruiting plan when you hire a new coordinator?
Yeah, with the best of them, Isaac, they'll have a plan as soon as they're there, right? As soon as they interview for that job, the best recruiters should be ready to hit the ground running whenever things become official and they can hit the road or make phone calls, what have you. So I do think that a coach like Gene Chizik, who was out of the business for a little bit and now is jumping back in, I do think that he was kind of refreshed and ready to go. And I think that we'll see the results of that on the trail. But we're seeing it in the portal too, right? Obviously, a lot of these additions have been defensive additions. We've seen them add prospects at all three levels now, D-line, linebacker, DB, over the last month or so. So that's something that I think is the quickest fix in terms of adjusting your plan, because it's like, hey, we can get guys, in Gene's case, guys that he was, charting a little bit, working for the SEC network or ESPN.
Yeah.
Like, hey, I remember this guy from the Ohio State game. He looked pretty good. Now he can implement that and say, hey, we can bring him in to maybe help us out right now, or strengthen strengths, or make up for some potential weaknesses. And I think one element of making that switch is just volume. You just need more bodies. If you're going to run an aggressive defense, you're going to have maybe a shorter rotation, meaning guys are playing less snaps because you want them attacking aggressive downhill, competing at the line of scrimmage or shortly thereafter, compared to a more conservative defense that plays a lot more zone coverage, doesn't rush the passer or blitz as much. Then you could probably leave guys on the field a little bit more. So if your rotation shortens and you get more aggressive, you've got to have more bodies, more edge rushers, more defensive backs, kind of what we're seeing with UNC attacking the portal in and of itself. And then in terms of the body style, I think you're recruiting different players relative to the position. So with your defensive backs, you want guys who are a little bit more comfortable at the line of scrimmage. So typically a longer corner, players who can play in the sub package that have great hips, because they're going to be a little bit more reliant on man coverage. So if you're a nickel type of corner, a guy who's quicker than fast, technically sound, understands leverage, a little bit more polished than your lengthy outside corner, I think those are some adjustments that you'll make in courting those prospects. And then on the edge, which is really the biggest difference to me in one scheme versus the next, is you're going to go lighter and faster. I think, in a traditional 4-3, you're asking a lot of your defensive ends. You're asking them to be the primary pass rushers, but also to set the edge in the run game. I think you can get away from that a little bit more when you bounce out to a 3-4, and those edge guys can be pass rush first type of prospects. So probably a little bit leaner, a little bit quicker on the edge, and they can utilize that to then become support players in the run game, as opposed to being designated and a little bit more similarly built like an offensive lineman to combat that at 260, 270, whatever it may be. So I think those are the biggest differences in recruiting some of those players on defense. Some of them will feel similar, right? Your one technique was your 3 technique, and you want that versatility, recruiting from one staff to the next. Same thing with the inside linebackers. I think you're asking very similar things. They're just playing in a little bit different of a gap, but really responsibility-wise, especially in this day and age, Isaac, it's largely the same. You're playing in space a lot. You're a traffic controller, setting the defense. You're still doing all of those things. It's just a little bit more simplified in this kind of scheme. And taking it back to Cavazos, that's one thing he said he loved. He said, this is a scheme where I can just go do me. I can go lock up on a receiver, or I can play aggressive at the line of scrimmage, knowing I have help over the top. It's a much more simplified look than what he felt like he had at Ohio State, and that was one of the perks of coming to Carolina.
Yeah. So what do I do, though, if I'm one of these guys that's been in the program or been in the system for a while, and now I'm the odd man out?
That's tough. The portal certainly does work both ways, but I think that's what spring practice is certainly for, bringing in guys to compete and, take my job. If I'm one of those guys on the outside looking in, you got to combat it. You kind of assimilate or you don't. And I think that's part of self-scouting anyway. Gene Chizik is not only targeting new players to build and add on to this defense, but he's got to see what he has on his current defense as well. So you certainly want to challenge guys to a certain extent to maybe get outside of their comfort zone and perhaps either discover something new that they're actually good at or will be good at, or kind of confirm, hey, maybe this scheme and this position isn't quite right here. And doing so in the spring kind of enables a little bit more time for guys to hit the portal or to make those, again, business decisions in terms of assimilating or not. So I think self-scouting is a big part of it as well.
And I would imagine as a defensive coordinator, you want the guys that are doing what you just said of like, okay, that doesn't match who I am anymore, but how can I reinvent myself? Like, that's the guy I want to go to war with every day of the week, right?
100%. I think in almost any position, obviously quarterback doesn't really fit into this, but almost everywhere else, you have to be able to do so many things. And the more different elements of athleticism and physicality you could bring can only really enhance where your game is and where it may go. So when the scheme change comes in, that should get guys excited. It's going to be something different. It's going to be, in theory, a little bit more freeing mentally to enable you to be able to play to your athletic self, without thinking as much pre-snap, stuff like that. So that should be an exciting transition for most of the defensive prospects or players, I should say. And for those who don't see it that way, it's an opportunity to either look elsewhere or give it time and see if it's something you can buy into. I think resets like that are often invigorating in nature. How many times, we see it every year, Isaac, how many times do we see a coaching staff recruit a certain team, a certain player, and then the new coaching staff comes in and all of a sudden he's better than ever? And it's like, wow, that last staff evaluated a great player, but maybe they weren't utilizing him the right way. And now we can free him up and open him up to his true potential. So those things happen as well. So it's important to self-scout, but as a coach, you're also looking to those players who actually are open to that assimilation and can accept the challenge. Because look, if they all want to play professional football, they're going to have to do that at the next level anyway.
Exactly. And that, I think, I love that you ended on that, because draftability has to play a huge role in motivation and all these things that they're doing. That's really good. Thank you. Well, we're going to talk a little bit more then about, okay, we're getting this personnel. Now, how does it transition to the field, and when do we see that taking place and clicking into place? We're going to talk about that in just a second, but first let me tell you just a little bit about BetOnline. BetOnline is your number one source for all your betting stats and sports info. Find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's NBA playoffs and the start of the MLB season. They've even already published odds for next year's Final Four. Kentucky leads the way at 8-1 odds, but the Tar Heels are right behind at 10-1. BetOnline is your continued source for all your sports wagering info, from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. So, head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more about all the trends in action. Built online, where the game starts. We're back here on Locked on Tar Heels with brother John Garcia Jr. We're talking all about Carolina's defensive scheme switch, bringing in Gene Chizik and everything that he's doing and what that means for recruits and the on-field product. And John, before we talk about the on-field product, one other thing I did want to ask you is, you know, we talked about spring ball being this time when you kind of see like, oh, maybe I should enter the transfer portal. What happens, though, in a scenario where you go through spring ball and then somebody transfers in after that? And so if let's say I'm a member of Carolina secondary, and now here comes Lejond Cavazos, and maybe I was 2 or 3 on the depth chart, and now I move down to 3 or 4. Like, how seriously at that point post spring football, but not really know it, like I haven't seen this guy on the field. Can I beat him out? How often do you bet on yourself? How often do you say, this probably ain't for me anymore?
That's a great question, Isaac, and one we don't get a whole lot of. But look, that's the nature of it, right? I mean, these coaches are literally on a shorter and quicker clock than they've ever been in college football. We're seeing coaching staffs get fired after year 1, year 2. I mean, that didn't happen 10 years ago.
No.
Used to get really 4 and then 3 if it was really bad. That was kind of the general rule. Like, you get to overhaul the entire roster. But now, and the portal only furthers this. Now you get less time because it's like, hey, you've got the portal, you've got high school, you've got junior college recruits, figure it out. So I do think that's an important thing to consider. But you have to understand that these coaches are always going to try to upgrade their roster. That is the nature of the business nature of college football. Just like we see in the NFL, every offseason, there's a release or two that people are like, how could you release this guy? He did this last year. Yeah. Well, somewhere, whether it's financially or on the field, they feel like they can have an advantage of getting another guy or promoting another guy or whatever it is. So it's kind of, back into professionalizing the college game. You have to prove yourself to your staff year in, year out, sometimes week in, week out, relative to the team you're playing, because the game plans change. And I think that creates that competitive culture that builds great teams. And it's certainly not for everyone. But there's 350 teams that play football in college. 65 are in the Power 5, 130 are FBS, and the rest aren't. So there's a spot for you somewhere. But that competitive culture is what you want to create. And taking it back to Lejond, that's something he said. He said, look, when I was there, he wasn't just with the coaching staff or just with Armando Bacot. He was with the DBs. He was with Storm. He was with Tony Grimes. He was with all of these players. And they were talking about playing together, so it's something that they recognize and say, hey, we need another DB, great, let's do it. So I do think that creates a competitive culture. It makes practices better. It makes your wide receiver unit better. Josh Downs and those guys. So I do think that is how you win. But transition, attrition, whatever you want to call it, is just an unintended consequence. And sometimes it's for the betterment of the program. Honestly. Yeah,
man, I know, like, Carolina is one of these schools that has now hired a GM, Patrick Suddas, who manages all this. And I do not envy his job in any way. Like, it's got to be so difficult. Like, I don't see it. So, John, let's go back just even a year or two prior to the transfer portal being a thing and prior to the one-time transfer waiver that student athletes had. How long in that era does it take to see the change of personnel on field when we have a coordinator switch?
I think it takes longer because you just have less players and there's less pressure on those players because more aren't being brought in. So I think it takes a little bit longer to settle it, but there's just less bodies to rep it, right? And a lot of
Yeah.
times that's really what it comes down to, just how many good reps can you get. It's why if you play, you play in a great secondary, you probably have good receivers on your team because you're repping against those guys every single day.
Yeah.
And the more the merrier for the most part. So when there is less transition and less roster turnover, it could probably take a little bit longer physically because you don't have the bodies. Mentally, you're probably further along, right? Because it's less brains to train, if you will.
Yeah.
So it is really fascinating to look at it. But again, the coaches had more time to implement their schemes. They had a longer leash in terms of if things weren't going well. So it almost feels like a different era of college football, even just going back 5 years, before the portal, which is crazy to say out loud. I don't think I've said that out loud yet, but that's kind of what it feels like. It feels like it was more structured for the long haul versus now where it's about, winning today.
Yeah. That's such an interesting point you just made about training the brain, the mental side of the game versus the physicality side of the game. And because in some of those moments, you might have technically less talented teams that might function as a better unit, and ultimately, while less talented, could be a better defensive unit in total. Is that a real thing?
It is. And I think college basketball is a great example of that. Every year in the tournament, there's all these one and dones with, Duke and Carolina and Kentucky or whoever else, and they perform well. And sometimes they go all the way, but there's always Villanova, Gonzaga. There's always a team that has just kind of built through time that is ready to compete. I mean, look at St. Peter's this past year.
Yes, exactly.
Those guys had been there for a while. So, I mean,
Yeah.
there is something to be said for that. But again, you don't have as long a leash nowadays. So it's really a tough call to pick, one side versus the other. If you're a fan of the Tar Heels, do you prefer it 5 years ago or today? I mean, you could really build the argument for either side. But yeah, you want talent in the end, though. I mean, I think the best coaches will tell you. I mean, Nick Saban says it like every championship. He's like, it's the players. He's like, I appreciate it, but it's the players, even though I have all these records. So I do believe him, especially at the collegiate level. You're more inclined to let the players just go, because if you have the more talented roster, 9 times out of 10, you're probably going to win the game.
And that's why you love having somebody like Mack Brown at the top of the pyramid, who is a phenomenal recruiter and is going to be able to convince that talent of the culture that's happening in Chapel Hill. John, just one last question for you is, does the pressure that comes with this shorter leash, does that put more pressure on the players or the DC or the head coach?
It's probably the head coach, because ultimately he's accountable. But everyone shares the pressure, though. Everyone feels that urgency, or they should. A winning program should feel it. You go at the very top again. Georgia has a sour taste in their mouth after that SEC championship game, and they get their payback on Alabama. And a lot of those players say that the practice intensity really picked up after a loss. They felt that urgency, and that's just after one loss in one game, but you can extrapolate that over a season, whether it's a coach on the hot seat. These players have internet, right? They see it. Nebraska players, Auburn players going into this year are certainly aware of the urgency that I'm assuming they're feeling every day from their coaching staffs. So I do think it kind of bounces off one group onto the next, but if everyone embraces it kind of together, you can kind of catch lightning in the bottle. Because remember, Jim Harbaugh was on the hot seat like 18 months ago, and now he's coming off of a college football playoff appearance. So it can turn around very fast in college football, which is why it's so darn entertaining.
Yeah, absolutely. And such is life in this new era. And so Gene Chizik has a short leash. He's getting guys in. We're going to have to see the transformation on the field come this fall. Can't wait to see it. John Garcia Jr., as always, my friend, thank you so much for all your wisdom and insights. You do such a good job.
Always fun with you, brother. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate you. We'll see you next week. That brings us to the end of another great week here on Locked On Tar Heels. Man, all sorts of great conversations. Once again, I'm so grateful to John Garcia for joining us, as he always does. Please go subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen, or if you're watching, go ahead and just hit that subscribe button. It's just right there on screen. It takes 2 seconds. We're closing in on 3,000 subscribers. Going to hit it very, very soon. You can follow the show at Locked On Heels. You can follow me at Isaac Schade, ISAACSCHADE. And also, go make sure you give John Garcia Jr. a follow on Twitter. He's got great content coming out all the time. If you want to talk more with me about anything at all, you can email the show lockedontarheels@gmail.com. Well, coming up next week, oh man, we got some fun conversations. Coach Pat Kilby and I are going to be unpacking Gigi Jackson just like we did with Simeon Wilcher this week. We're going to be talking with John Garcia more about some other football things. Can't wait for another great week here on Locked On Tar Heels. But while you're waiting, let me encourage you to make Locked On ACC your second listen today. Get all your daily ACC news in 30 minutes or less, free and available wherever you get podcasts. Hey folks, thanks so much for spending part of another week hanging out with me, talking Carolina sports and everything else. I really hope that you have a great weekend, and I can't wait to see you right back here next week on Locked On Tar Heels. But until then, I want to remind you, it's always a great day to be a Tar Heel. Until next week, peace.